Hi, my name is Allison Ellis, and this is my senior SEM presentation on women's role in the American Revolution. So, my research question is, what role did women play in the American Revolution? My thesis was that women played an influential role on the men around them and also played a role in the domestic sphere to help with independence during the American Revolution. So, starting out, talking about kind of what women were doing at the time or a little bit before the American Revolution. So women played pretty much a domestic role solely. They basically were tasked with marrying, with taking care of the house, and with having children. So because of this, women didn't really receive a formal education. A lot of men or a lot of boys would go off to England and get their formal education, but women really didn't do that. So when they were girls, if they were in a wealthy household, women would often be tutored either by their mother or by a private tutor in the home. In poorer households, women or girls were taught housewifery skills, so cooking, cleaning, taking care of the house, all of that kind of stuff. And in particularly poor situations, girls were basically apprenticed out or kind of bartered for some kind of monetary gain by the family, and they were apprenticed out to other households to learn housewifery skills. So as far as women's rights go at the time, there really weren't a lot of rights for women. Women could not own their own property in any sense. So women basically couldn't own their own jewelry, they couldn't own their clothes, they couldn't own any property at all. Even in a sense of inheritance, British inheritance laws made it extremely hard for women to even inherit property from their husbands if they had died. So women were only guaranteed about a third of the property of their dead husbands. The other 2/3 would go elsewhere. So this made it extremely hard for women to participate in the American Revolutionary movement in a big political stance like men did. They didn't have a voice for themselves, so they had to take to other means. So women took a pretty domestic role in the independence movement. So one of the biggest things they did was boycotting against British goods. This started in the New England area and kind of spread from there, but was mainly focused in New England. So women got together and basically said, we are not going to buy British goods anymore. We are going to make everything we need at home. We are going to make it American, to kind of make a political statement to hurt the British industry by doing this domestic good. So women got together in sewing and spinning circles that most of the time in New England took place after a religious service. So women were combining religion and politics and putting them together and kind of making their own political statement by doing that, by spinning their own homespun clothing and cloth. So this spread rapidly, and with this some women became radical. So you hear of the tarring and feathering of merchants that did not participate in the boycott. They were still trying to sell British goods. So women would participate with men to tar and feather, humiliate, hurt these men that were not participating in the boycott. Women also participated in food riots. There were about 37 food riots that took place in the colonies from 1774 to 1779 in 5 different colonies throughout the U.S. And women were responsible for starting about a third of these, but they participated in probably all of them because food was such a big part of the domestic duties of a woman to feed her family. So if she couldn't feed her family, there were issues. So women took it among themselves to riot against merchants that were withholding food from patriots, taxing goods, or having inflated prices because of the wartime. So that was one of the biggest wartime issues that women took an active role in. So moving on to some of the prominent women of the time, Mercy Otis Warren is the name that comes to everybody's mind at first. She was a writer who published anonymous satirical plays against British leaders and their supporters in Massachusetts newspapers. Of course, plays were forbidden in the colonies at the time by the British, so these plays were meant to be read and not performed. And this is not all she did. She also had a lot of correspondence with influential American revolutionaries at the time, like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and mainly John Adams, who she had a great correspondence with, and we have so many letters between the two of them. And he actually influenced her to write on the Boston Tea Party and publish it in a Massachusetts newspaper about the heroes that that participated in the Boston Tea Party. One thing about her is that she was not a feminist. She did not like women's rights. She thought that the women were supposed to stay at home and take a passive role while the men were out in the public sphere. So, on the other hand, you had Catherine Macaulay, who was actually a British woman who wrote histories on American and British history and also applied contemporary political themes like independence movement into her histories, which sparked a lot of controversy and a lot of patriotism in American people. So she also wrote broadsides to her fellow Englishmen, Scotsmen, Irishmen, telling them that you cannot continue doing what you're doing, taxing the Americans without some kind of issue in the future, which obviously did take place, so she was right. So going back to her women's rights, she was a widow herself, so she actually did have some right to property, and she did not remarry, so that means her property did not go to her new husband, which it would if she had remarried. So I think this is where her feminism kind of stems from. And because of this, she gained a lot of friendship, and she corresponded with Abigail Adams a whole lot. So moving on to Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was a feisty lady. She was married to John Adams, who of course was a revolutionary diplomat at the time. He was involved in the Continental Congress, and we have so many of their correspondences back and forth. And Abigail Adams was very political in what she said and what she did, but unfortunately she didn't have a voice for herself. So she kind of had a lot of influence on what John Adams did and what John Adams did politically and the moves he made. So that's probably her biggest contribution to the American Revolutionary Movement, is what she wrote and influenced her husband to do. Unfortunately, her husband John Adams did not like women's rights like she did, and she was unable to kind of influence him to do anything about that. He would not move on the subject. So she did not have any winning influences on women's rights in that perspective. But finally, the women I'm going to talk about is, of course, Martha Washington herself. She was the revolutionary woman that I think took the biggest active role in being on the battlefields, being there for the men who needed her most. So she actually followed her husband George to the winter camps of Morristown in 1777 and Valley Forge in 1778. So she took homespun cloth from Mount Vernon and actually knitted and sewed clothing and socks for the soldiers at these winter camps who were freezing to death. And she also created sewing circles with other officers' wives that were at the winter camps to help these men. And she actually went and hand-delivered these clothing pieces as well as food to the men that needed it most at Valley Forge. And that was really important, and she was there, she was actively participating in this, and men would see her face and get hope from her because she was handing out things that the Continental Congress could not provide. And a lot of people say that without women like this participating in the American Revolution, the Continental Army would not have survived. So kind of going off of that, we have the idea of the camp follower, which they are now said to be camp followers, but at the time they were called retainers. So this was a lot of time women who were wives, also servants who followed their masters into the army. So women or servants or somebody who had a connection to the men in the army would follow their people into the army and become retainers of the army. So this was very strictly enforced, that if you if you were going to be a retainer of the army, you basically had to have a purpose. You had to be there for a reason. You had to be a nurse. If you were a woman, you had to be a nurse. You had to be a seamstress, a cook, or a washerwoman. A washerwoman was a woman who washed the laundry of the men at the camp, and they were allowed to charge men for their services, but prices were regulated by the officials at the camp. So it didn't have to be, retainers didn't have to be women, but a lot of the time they were. So as far as nurses go as well, you weren't considered to be a nurse if you were just doing this temporarily. If you were just kind of filling in after a battle and there were a lot of injuries, you had to be working for the hospital department to get your pension after the war, from being a nurse. Also, it's worth mentioning that some women did find ways to participate actively in battle. There are very few cases of women being in battle, but there are some. They were not allowed to be in battle, they were not allowed to be soldiers, but there are a few cases, and one of the main cases is Deborah Sampson Gannett. Deborah Sampson Gannett disguised herself as a man and joined the army for the full term of the war. She was injured twice, once shot through the shoulder, and once gashed in the head by a sword. Her gender was not discovered during her time having either of these injuries, but it was discovered later on when she had a fever in a hospital. She was discovered to be a woman. After that, she was released from the army, discharged by George Washington himself after she explained the situation. She had fought in the Battle of Yorktown and other battles. She was in the army for quite a few years, being disguised as a man and fighting battles like men were, and people didn't know. But she was discharged by George Washington, and later on, after the war was over, she was actually awarded a pension by Congress, and not only that, but her husband also received a pension as a spouse of a soldier after she died. So I think that was really an important move, to know that she was treated correctly. Even if she was a woman, she did fight, and she did receive a pension. So to conclude, I think women played a big role in the American Revolution, even if it was passive, but there were cases of women taking active roles, and just because it's not talked about doesn't mean it didn't happen. And I think that we need to look into what the other half of the population was doing during the time of the American Revolution, and really think about how they took a role in independence from Great Britain. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope everybody's doing well and stays safe and at home. Thank you.